of you may have heard the news item in the past week that late-night TV show host David Letterman is going to retire. He's going to stop doing his show after 2015. A few years ago, I was sitting in a barber shop, and I was leafing through one of the magazines waiting for the haircut, and I remember reading a little piece that at the time Letterman had just renewed his contract and that his annual salary was in the neighborhood of about $17 million. And I thought, $17 million a year for what he does, that's really something. Now, I've seen the show a few times, and I think the strongest part are his top 10 lists. Every once in a while, he'll do the top 10 reasons you know your kid had a bad first day at school, or the top 10 reasons why then Vice President Dan Quayle hated France, or something silly or bizarre like that. Paul read for us rather a lengthy Bible story from John chapter 11 about the raising of Lazarus. Of all the stories in the Bible, it is one of my very favorites. And there are so many amazing lessons for us to take away that I couldn't narrow it down to just one or two or three. And so I'm going to take a few minutes and speak about the top 10 things we learn in the raising of Lazarus. Number 10, John says that Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. They were two sisters and a brother who lived in the village of Bethany, which was near Jerusalem. And they were probably, at least as far as we know, Jesus' closest friends. Now, he had other friends. Sometimes Jesus called the 12 disciples his friends. But they were like the friends he worked with. And he was kind of their boss. But Mary and Martha and Lazarus were his closest real friends. I think back to some of the times when I was in university and I had some really great friends. Friends that I spent all kinds of time with. Friends I would get together on a Friday or Saturday and watch a movie with. Or friends that I would go out and have dinner with. Or friends that I would just goof around with. Friendship is such a wonderful thing, isn't it? You know, we find those whom we enjoy being around, and friends are those who are there for us, and we try to be there for them. Friends are people we can just be ourselves around. I think it's beautiful to think of Jesus as a person just like you and me, who had close friends. Number 9, Lazarus got sick. In fact, very sick. And so his sisters sent a message summoning Jesus. And when Jesus got the message, he waited where he was for 2 whole days. And I love that Jesus waited when he got that message. I don't know about you, but I often feel like there are just so many demands on my time and so many expectations. I often have this constant feeling that I can't do it all, and that I won't be able to accomplish what I need to accomplish in the time allotted. The same thing happened to Jesus. And yet when he was summoned with a request, he had the courage and the ability to wait a couple of days before responding. Wouldn't it be nice in our lives to be able to wait a couple of days on something that someone has pressed us to do? Especially if it's some chores around the house or something like that. We often feel as though the world revolves around us, and we have to be everywhere all the time, and that everything is up to us to do. And we have the weight of the world on our shoulders. And yet Jesus showed that we are not in control. Things are not in our hands. And if he was able to put his decisions and his actions into God's hands and to rely on God's timing, then so can we. Number 8, when Jesus eventually decided to go to Bethany where his friends lived, the disciples urged him not to. They said, "Don't you remember that the Jewish leaders are trying to stone you?" They wanted to kill him. And Bethany was so near Jerusalem that if Jesus went there, surely the religious leaders would find out where he was and they would come after him and he would be in danger. And Jesus said, "Right now it's the daylight and I have work to do." In other words, Jesus was saying he had to make hay while the sun was shining. But then right after that, Jesus said, "I am the light of the world." So in other words, when he brought the light of God into the world, it was always daytime, and since he had things to do, important things, it was always the right time to do them when he was going to do them. And he was so committed to the call of God on his life that he did whatever he had to do, whenever he had to do it, regardless of the personal consequences. Number 7, Lazarus died. You know, I think it's a wonderful demonstration of the real life of the gospel stories and the real life that Jesus experienced. Something bad happened to Jesus and to his dear friends. Their friend died. A few years ago, there was somebody that I went to high school with who died. Now, he wasn't a close friend, but his sister and brother-in-law were my very close friends and are my close friends. And when he died, suddenly and unexpectedly, his family called me and asked me to do the funeral. And it was really difficult to go and be with these close friends that I'd had for a very long time and to talk to them about their son and brother who had died. And then when it came time to do the funeral, I went, and there were dozens and dozens of people that I had gone to school with, and I hadn't seen some of them in 10 years. And the whole reason we'd come together was because we had this mutual friend who had died. And that had never happened to us before. And Jesus experienced that as well. Number 6, when Jesus eventually decided to go and travel to Bethany, he was approaching the village, and people heard that he was on the way and that he was almost there. and Lazarus' sister Martha ran out to meet him on the edge of town, and she said, "Lord, if you had been here, if only you had been here, our brother would not have died." And Jesus responded saying, "Martha, your brother will live." And then she said, "Well, I know he will live at the resurrection on the last day." Almost more than any other interchange in the Bible, this tells us so much about the world that Jesus lived in. You see, he and most of his fellow Jews had as their future hope that God would usher in a new age of universal history that would bring an end to all the things that didn't really belong in God's good creation. God would finally defeat the enemies of God's people, and that all of God's people, past and present, would be raised to a new and everlasting life, not in an immaterial escape from creation, but with renewed bodies in a renewed creation fit for everlasting life in the presence of God. As Martha called it, the resurrection on the last day. And understanding this provides so much insight into the story of the New Testament. What happened on Good Friday? And what happened on the first Easter? See, in some ways, Jesus' resurrection at Easter fit so well into the Jewish expectation. And yet, in one important way, it was a complete surprise because no one ever expected it to happen to one person ahead of time. And yet, this expectation and this surprise provides not perfect understanding, but clear insight into the New Testament story. Number 5, in that same conversation with Martha, Jesus said, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, though they die, will live." I am the resurrection and the life. In other words, Jesus was saying that this future hope of God's people was already coming true in his life, in his actions, and in his teachings. God's promised future was already breaking into the present in him. Number 4, John tells us Jesus wept. When Jesus got into Bethany, he could see that Lazarus' sisters were very sad. They were probably crying, and all the other extended family and friends they had gathered around them, and they were all very upset and crying. And John tells us Jesus was deeply troubled, and he wept. When I was studying theology, I took a few classes on the Greek language of the New Testament, and one of the assignments we had was to stand up in the front of the class and to recite aloud 2 whole verses. Our professor said, Jesus wept didn't count as one of those verses. It's such a short verse that says so little, and yet it is so wonderful and says so much. That Jesus was a person just like you and me who experience the same emotions that you and I do. And what's especially remarkable is Jesus weeping in the context of having what we might call a perfect personal faith. And in the context of knowing what he was about to do. I sometimes feel as though if we really had such a perfect faith in God, that we would never really be that upset, even when we were experiencing difficult things or going through difficult challenges, that we would somehow be able to say, well, it's all in God's hands and everything's going to work out, and we would be happy all the time, or at very least content. Well, if something makes us sad, if we are moved to tears, it's not because we don't have faith, it's just because we're human. Number 3, there was a real division of opinion about Jesus. When he arrived in Bethany, many were glad to see him, but others questioned him and criticized him. They said, wasn't this the guy that just opened the eyes of the man who had been born blind? In chapter 9, a story we read here last week, Jesus gave sight to someone who had been blind since birth. And they're wondering why this person who had done that couldn't have helped out poor Lazarus with his illness. And so they questioned Jesus and they criticized him. Now put yourself in Jesus' shoes. He was doing precisely what he felt God calling him to do. And he was doing it on the timeline that God had laid before him. And yet, nonetheless, there were questioners and critics. I imagine that whether we're in school or at work or in some other situation, there may be times when we're doing what we feel God is calling us to do. We're trying to do what is the right thing according to God's plan and purpose for our lives. And yet people will question and criticize. No matter what, we can have the strength and the courage and the trust to do the right thing, and to be assured that in that, God is in control. God is looking after us. Number 2, Jesus showed sheer grace. He raised his friend Lazarus and called him out from the tomb. Now, as with all of the so-called miracles in the Bible, what we're meant to see is that the power of God was at work in Jesus. And that this power was the power of the Creator effecting new creation in the midst of the old creation. And how this was happening in and through Jesus. But Jesus didn't have to do any of this. And yet he called out his friend to give him a second chance at life out of sheer grace. Nothing Lazarus had done to deserve it. Nothing other than the gracious generosity and love of God. Many of you know that in the United States, the president has the ability and the power to pardon a convicted criminal. Now, presidents almost always do this on the last day of their term in office because it's politically unpopular. And I remember on the last day of Bill Clinton's term in January of 2001, he pardoned a number of people, including his half-brother Roger Clinton, who had served a year in jail in the mid-1980s for some drug offense. And as they always do, the political pundits were going through the list of presidential pardons and finding out who these people were and what they'd been accused of or what they'd been convicted of and what they'd been let off the hook for. And I remember one commentator was so delighted to see the president's half-brother receiving the pardon because she said, if you can't pardon your brother, who can you pardon? Because a pardon is nothing but grace. On the Letterman show, the number one item on the top 10 list has the reputation for always being the least humorous. And so it is with our top 10 list. You see, the number one thing we can take away, I think, is that this episode led almost directly to Jesus' arrest, torture, and execution. You see, after Jesus called Lazarus out from the tomb, many, John says, put their faith in him. But many others were offended, upset, and angry. And in fact, as soon as word got to the religious leaders in Jerusalem, they called an emergency meeting of their council. And they debated, what are we going to do about this guy? And they believed that he was going to become so popular that he would be a threat to their own positions of influence. You see, the real powers, the political powers of the day were the Romans. And what the Romans did almost wherever they went in the empire was to appoint local people to govern and rule their own. And so the religious leaders who had positions of authority based in the temple really held these positions at the pleasure of the Romans. In exchange for the privileges that they received from the Romans, they had to do a good job of keeping peace, order, and stability. And they were deathly afraid that Jesus was a fatal threat to their positions of power. And that if things got out of hand, the Romans would take away their government of their own Jewish people. And so they decided that of all the things Jesus did, this was the last straw, that they couldn't let him go any further. And from this point on, they had their hearts set on finding, arresting, and doing away with Jesus. And for Jesus, this episode was really the point of no return. From this point on, his path led directly to the cross, which, incidentally and wonderfully, is the place where and the means by which we see that he was and is the Savior of the world, the place and the means by which he won for us the certain hope and promise of eternal life. Eternity in the presence of God our Maker. And these, I think, are the top 10 things we can learn about the wonderful story of the raising of Lazarus. Our next hymn together is number 326.